the US invades Greenland, then what?
Well, the future of Greenland is for Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark, and for Greenland and the future of Denmark only. And Denmark is a very close ally of the UK, both in Europe and in NATO, and it's very important that we're clear about the principles applicable to here. Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark must determine the future of Greenland and nobody else.
This is the moment Sir Keir Starmer chooses clarity over caution. Asked directly about a hypothetical American move on Greenland, he does not deflect, soften, or reframe the question. Instead, he draws a firm boundary. Greenland's future, he says, belongs only to Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark. No qualifiers, no diplomatic hedging. By explicitly naming Denmark as a close ally of the United Kingdom within both Europe and NATO, Starmer elevates the statement beyond speculation and places it inside the architecture of international alliances. This is not a theoretical discussion about global power. It is a declaration about limits. The implication is significant. Even the closest allies are constrained by rules, and sovereignty remains non-negotiable. In making that point so plainly, Starmer signals a leadership style that prioritizes predictability and structure over improvisation. This opening sets the tone for everything that follows. The question now is whether this insistence on rules holds when the pressure comes from other directions and from other allies.
If you won't condemn Donald Trump over Venezuela, how can we lecture Russia over its invasion of Ukraine, or if China takes action against Taiwan?
Well, the position of this government is that what we need in Venezuela is a peaceful transition to democracy. That was our position before this weekend. It remains our position. The president was illegitimate and caused untold misery across Venezuela. International law is the framework, is the anchor or the benchmark against which we judge the actions of all other governments. And it is, of course, for the US to justify the action that it has taken. It is not straightforward, it is complicated, and even today there are further developments. But I won't shy away from the fact that international law is the framework and is the benchmark.
It is precisely that test of consistency that underpins the next exchange as Sir Keir Starmer is pressed on Venezuela. Here, the challenge is direct. How does Britain maintain moral authority when its closest ally takes controversial action? Starmer's response is revealing. Rather than shifting ground, he anchors his position in continuity. He states that the UK's stance, support for a peaceful transition to democracy, has not changed and did not emerge overnight. By describing Venezuela's leadership as illegitimate and responsible for deep suffering, he outlines the moral context without turning the issue into a public rupture with Washington. Instead, he repeatedly returns to one principle: international law as the benchmark by which all governments are judged. This repetition is deliberate. It signals restraint, but also discipline. Starmer acknowledges that the situation is complicated and still evolving, rejecting the temptation to offer simple answers to complex problems. In doing so, he presents Britain not as a reactive actor, but as a stabilising one, committed to rules even when alliances are tested. That emphasis on credibility and consistency does not stop at the water's edge. It is the same framework he applies when the conversation turns inward to British politics itself.
Nigel Farage says a lot of things that aren't true and don't come to fruition. So he stood in front of your viewers in the Brexit referendum and said, if we leave the EU, migration will come down. Well, it didn't come down. It quadrupled. The Boris Johnson wave. He said if we leave the EU, you'd have £350 million a week for the NHS. That didn't turn out to be the case. And he said if we left the EU, we'd cut lots of red tape. Try telling that to anyone who is dealing and doing business with the EU. So what you get with Nigel Farage is a lot of slippery things that are said, but when you hold them up to the light, they're not actually true, and peddling falsehoods is no way to solve the problems of this country.
With the discussion now firmly back on British soil, Sir Keir Starmer applies the same lens of credibility and accountability to domestic politics that he has already laid out on the international stage. Asked about Nigel Farage's rise in the polls and his appeal to voters, Starmer does not engage in personal criticism, nor does he dismiss Farage's support base. Instead, he reframes the issue entirely. For Starmer, the central question is not popularity, momentum, or media attention, but whether political leadership can be trusted to deliver what it promises. In doing so, he shifts the debate away from emotion and towards evidence. He reaches back to the Brexit referendum, not as a reopening of old arguments, but as an example of how political credibility is built or lost over time. During that campaign, Starmer notes, voters were presented with a series of firm assurances. Migration, they were told, would fall sharply once Britain left the European Union. The National Health Service would receive an additional £350 million a week. Businesses would benefit from a dramatic reduction in red tape. These were not framed as aspirations or long-term goals, but as direct consequences of a single political decision. Starmer's critique rests on the gap between those assurances and the reality that followed. He argues that migration did not decrease but rose significantly in the years after Brexit. The promised funding for the NHS did not arrive in the form or scale that had been advertised. Far from reducing bureaucracy, many businesses trading with Europe found themselves dealing with additional layers of regulation, paperwork, and cost. By listing these outcomes methodically, Starmer avoids rhetorical flourish and instead constructs a case based on sequence and consequence. His implication is clear. When political claims are made with certainty and fail to materialise, the damage is not limited to one policy area. It undermines confidence in governance itself. Importantly, Starmer does not present these failures as technical miscalculations. He frames them as warnings. In his telling, repeated gaps between promise and delivery create a pattern that voters should examine carefully. Leadership, he suggests, is not defined by the boldness of claims made during campaigns, but by whether those claims survive contact with reality. This approach allows Starmer to challenge Farage's credibility without engaging in personal attacks, positioning himself instead as an advocate for accountability, evidence, and institutional responsibility. The underlying message is that trust, once eroded, cannot be rebuilt through louder promises or sharper slogans. Starmer then broadens his argument beyond Nigel Farage as an individual figure, turning his focus to the wider consequences of misinformation and oversimplification in British politics. He warns that when exaggerated or misleading claims are allowed to dominate public debate, the impact reaches far beyond election cycles. False certainty, he argues, distorts public expectations and weakens the ability of governments to address long-term challenges. Issues such as migration, public spending, and economic competitiveness are inherently complex, shaped by global forces as much as domestic decisions. Presenting them as problems with quick or absolute solutions may win attention, but it ultimately leads to disillusionment. In this context, Starmer frames misinformation not merely as a political tactic, but as a structural risk to effective governance. When voters are led to believe that difficult trade-offs do not exist, trust collapses when reality intervenes. Governments are then forced into reactive decision-making, managing disappointment rather than delivering strategy. Starmer's warning is that this cycle weakens democratic institutions and reduces the space for serious policy discussion. By focusing on falsehoods rather than facts, politics becomes performative rather than practical. Crucially, Starmer connects this domestic argument back to the principles he outlined earlier on foreign policy. Just as international law exists to constrain power and provide predictability between states, factual accuracy and accountability serve the same function within a democracy. Rules, he suggests, are not obstacles to action, but the foundations that make sustained action possible. Without them, both international relations and domestic governance become unstable, driven by short-term pressure rather than long-term planning. As he concludes, Starmer positions credibility as the defining test of leadership. Peddling claims that do not withstand scrutiny, he argues, is no way to solve the country's problems, not because disagreement is illegitimate, but because solutions require honesty about limits, costs, and consequences. The closing message is deliberately sober. Britain's challenges, in his framing, cannot be met through rhetoric alone. They require leaders prepared to accept responsibility for what they promise and to operate within the constraints they acknowledge. In that sense, Starmer is offering more than criticism. He is presenting a case for a different political standard, one in which trust is earned through consistency and authority flows from credibility rather than volume.